Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Amy, I'm going to dive straight in and start with you.
All right, let's do it.
Can you go ahead and give us some context as to how agentic AI is reshaping the threat landscape?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this is an interesting question because I think it's reshaping the threat landscape both on the attacker side and on the defense side. And I think the biggest thing that we've seen so far pervasively across the industry is that AI is changing the economic structure of the attacks that we're facing. So it's suddenly very inexpensive for threat actors to generate meaningful variations. And I think all of us in this room have probably experienced the increase in phishing lures, the increase in sophistication of them. And so all businesses are now really having to deal with an increase in variations, sophisticated variations of existing attacks. And that's just something for businesses to know. It means that more of us are going to have to be able to defend against attacks at scale because the scale is a lot easier and cheaper to produce now. On the defender side, we're starting to really learn what this stuff is good at solving. And one of the things that it's very helpful to use this technology for is to find the needle in the needle stack, to take a bunch of different information in, be looking for a particular flow or thing that's happening within that information, and then prep a human or prep a presentation of what you might find. And so both sides of this are changing in the threat landscape. And maybe the last thing I would say there is that when things move at machine speed, all of the basics that we've known about forever, I think, in this field are suddenly a lot more important. Because when things can go wrong, if you've got a credential that's being used that's been harvested and is being used nefariously, now that's going wrong at machine speed rather than human speed. So that's kind of how the threat landscape is changing.
So Derek, turning to you, how are you applying agentic AI at BP right now, and how are you building capabilities towards the future?
Yeah, so let me start with the big picture. So we, like many others, really jumped in via experimentation. We were trying literally everything. And that took some time and work through. What we found through that whole process was that the organization didn't trust agentic AI. And we had to help solve that problem. And so how we went about it is we went to areas that were low risk and high value. Easy to say, but what that allowed us to do is look for areas that already had scale. So risk for us meant scale and access to data. And so global processes where you could automate knowledge management, internal customer service type areas, those gave us an opportunity to prove. And the beauty of those is they were easily measurable, because if you can't measure it, you can't get trust. So what that allowed us to do is to have a foundation. And then through that experimentation, what we learned is the foundation is really, really important. So we created our own platform that allows us to reuse, register, have the multi-models, and more importantly, give us the traceability, observability built in. I say that because we're still in the early stages of agentic AI in BP. And so that allowed us to get the organization moving. So that's how we've started. The other thing that we did is, from a security team, we wanted to lead from the front. We wanted to show how that innovation could play. And I don't know about your organizations, but if the security organization finds a way to make it okay, it's usually scaled across the organization. And so by us going first and trying to lead, it gave an opportunity to not just get our practitioners proficient, but also show what's possible within all the compliance, the legal and reg, and the security that we needed. So that's where we are. I guess the question for me is, how are you applying agentic AI in the compliance org in AWS?
So from a compliance perspective, across Amazon, we need to screen our customers and transactions against various sanctions requirements. And so that's across 160 businesses, starting at about 2 billion transactions, 2 billion transactions a day that we're screening against. This was an area that we really thought was sort of ripe from an agentic AI perspective. So we were very focused on identifying sort of more of the complex investigations investigations that we needed to be able to investigate, we were able to deploy our agentic AI solutions into that portion of our screening engine. It enabled us to significantly decrease the amount of time that we could get to disposition based on pattern recognition, and then actually being able to take action on the disposition that we had identified, which was really helpful to significantly enable us to be able to scale and reduce the cost from a compliance perspective. So again, we're pretty pleased. As you mentioned, it's still early days. We're looking at about 96% accuracy, 96% precision, and about 100% from a recall perspective on all of our historical parts. So it's been super fun. So Amy, turning back to you, when you think about security and innovation, how do you think through organizations being able to leverage AI to ensure that they're able to increase their security and not stifle innovation?
Yeah, I love this question. This is the perceived trade-off between security and innovation, or security and speed, is one of the things that I'm most passionate about eliminating or debunking, because I do not think there's any tension between those two if we're doing it right. And I think what it takes to do it right is that foundation, understanding that you're getting the basics right, understanding the risk that you're trying to eliminate. So if I think about my security organization as a business, it doesn't look like a traditional business. I don't have a traditional P&L, but I am trying to reduce risk or prevent risk from shipping to AWS customers as fast as possible at the lowest possible cost. And that kind of sets up both sides of the equation of the things I'm tracking day to day across the organization. And Gen AI is really changing for us the way that we can solve problems around identifying or preventing entire classes of security issues and then getting them out to production. And what we found internally, as you heard a little bit in the last talk, is that when our teams show up to our business partners, there to innovate with them, there to deliver to customers with them, it's much easier to kind of co-create the systems that that deliver value to our customers and eliminate this trade-off between security and innovation. I think it's crucial. And something that maybe wasn't talked about as much in the last talk that's really true for security organizations is that when you start to get that flywheel going, it changes how the security organization thinks of itself, right? This is sort of a self-reinforcing flywheel where if the business doesn't see us as friction and we don't see ourselves as friction, when we all see each other as problem solvers and innovators together, like something really magic happens to the security team too, I've found.
And in many cases, from a compliance and assurance perspective, business enablers as well.
Yes, that's right.
Hugely helpful. And teasing out a little bit more on that sort of compliance topic, data privacy, digital sovereignty, hot topics for all leaders across the globe. From a BP perspective, how are you approaching data sovereignty when deploying AI?
Yeah, so I think we have to start with the fact that we already have that challenge today without AI. And so we have controls and frameworks and in place as you would expect. So it's really for us, it's how do we deploy an AI governance framework alongside that? And to Amy's point, I love the saying of, make the easy thing and the right thing the same thing. And so in that context, when it comes to really sovereignty, really compliance, all the regs that you have to deal with, that's a key part. What I would say, how do we go about it? This is where your friends in legal and your friends in compliance, you really need to partner with. And for me, this means architecture becomes strategy. Because if you can architect solutions that enable that sovereignty, that enable that residency of the data from the ground up with legal and with your compliance teams, then you know you're building within the guardrails. And then you can truly innovate. Then you can truly go at pace. And you don't have to open up the reassessment every time there's a new feature or every time you want to do something that's a little different. And so that's one piece for us. We're still very much a human in the loop, and we can come back to that. But the other item for us as it comes into this phase is any rule or any policy that we put in place, it has to do two things. It has to be very clear on who's accessing what data based on what permission, We need that observability and audit trail, period, every time. And so then, again, it lets us answer that question of how do you know? How do you know that you're actually fully compliant? How do you know that your AI agent is doing what it's supposed to do? And so that for us is the overall tactic. But I would reinforce, we've learned the lesson the hard way that architecture and strategy in this context are really, really important from the ground up.
I love that, the legal and the compliance and the sort of security partnership that you see there. We've always had really good partnership with our legal team. I think, though, from a world of AI, especially as you see things like EU AI Act, et cetera, come out, we are deeply partnered. So a lot of our initiatives are co-created initiatives that we're running together, which is hugely helpful to be able to run fast, make decisions, and identify a key strategy. Another piece of the puzzle is how do we maintain human accountability in a world where AI agents are making autonomous decisions? Yeah. Derek, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so like I said, for us, we start with there has to be a human in the loop if it's impacting a financial decision, an operational decision, or of course, anything safety related. So from our organization, safety comes first. And we recognize that at this point, we may be making some trade-offs. We may be choosing something that's slightly less optimal until we get to a place that we have greater trust to keep that human in the loop. That's our starting point. And it's core to how we view AI from a responsible point of view, is also core to how we run the company in areas beyond AI. And I think that's a really important angle as we get into this is, when we talk about company transformation, it has to work for your company, in your culture, in your processes, in the things that make money or are critical for how you run your global enterprise. And so for us, having that human in the loop for our key processes of where do you drill the well? How do you execute certain trades? What do you do from a treasury point of view? What about people? So that for us has given us a bit of space that we can innovate on the front end of that, knowing that we have a human in the loop designed by default, so we can experiment. And then as over time, we expect that human in the loop decision-making to shrink. Will it ever go to zero? I'm not going to predict that, but we do expect it to shrink over time.
If I can jump in here too, I think one of the interesting things that you just said is that it might be worth poking at the difference between the human being in the loop and the human doing all of the manual steps that the human's already done, right? It's also important for us to have a human in the loop. Security is and assurance are places where human trust is at the core of what we're trying to do, but there's still tremendous opportunity to use this technology to make sure that the humans are as efficient as possible, to make sure that they have the best information possible on timelines of speed that the business needs. So yeah, it doesn't mean that there's not lots of opportunity there.
Or a human at every step. We're not saying that either.
Yeah.
And so, Amy, what best practices can leaders implement today to help their organizations prepare for the AI-enabled threats of the future?
There are sort of three big things. First, I think it's really important to do the working with the business to identify the goal that you're trying to achieve, the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And for us on this stage, that's usually about risk, but every one of you in your context will have a different thing. If you don't know where you're trying to go, and have that clear in your mind, it's much harder to break out of whatever processes or muscle memory you've got going on in your day-to-day. And that's where you'll maybe lose out on the opportunity to reconsider from the ground up, like Derek just said. And the second thing is, I think you need to get your hands dirty with this stuff. The field is changing so quickly. The capabilities are changing so quickly that a key part of getting the value out of this new technology is just trying it, right? Really reimagining and asking yourself, what would have to be true for this to take 10 seconds instead of 20 minutes? What would have to be true for this to be able to be presented in a more fully finished form versus the components that we might be getting today? Whatever your process is. And then third, I think it's really important to iterate across the prior two things that I just mentioned, right? With your business partners and your goal in mind. Don't be afraid to, in addition to experiment, learn from that to identify what you need to do next. And I think through all of that, like change can feel unsettling. We're in a really big moment. Things are changing rapidly, but ultimately our goals are still the same. This is just another new way of going after them. And that can be very freeing as you approach using AI to scale.
I think just to pull the thread a little bit more on that, one of the things that I have had an opportunity to really witness is the ability to lead by example and how that can really impact change. So, for example, one of the things that Amy actually started very quickly was very much to focus on very quick experimentation to ensure that we were not spending weeks long on building something and then coming back to the table to show it off, but to the point where there's sort of a weekly engagement on, like, what have you experimented with? What has failed? What has succeeded? And what's really helpful is the fact that it is happening across the leadership team, and then each of the leaders are taking that back into their teams and doing the same experimentation. And so there's this constant sort of experimentation and curiosity and learning through the failures, which has been hugely helpful, I think.
Yeah, we use a similar, we talk about making AI a habit and leaders to lead by example with that context. And it is, you have to get your hands dirty.
So to end our session, I'd like to ask both of you, what's the most impactful piece of advice you would give to organizations just starting their journey with AI agents?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I guess my first rule of advice is never take advice from others. But for us, I think there's two things. So let me just put my security hat on for a moment. Many security organizations, you look at the world through the lens of what could go wrong. And within the AI space, you really have to have a dual mandate. You have to look at it in the context of course, we're here to protect the firm and defend and enable innovation at pace. And so how do you do that? How do you solve that challenge is really important. And so what I would go back to is the future is uncertain. There will be technology evolutions super fast over the coming years. What we know is that the foundation has to be in place to take advantage of those. And so what is your model strategy? What is your compute approach? How accessible and curated is your data? And do you have a foundation that you've done all the security work on, the compliance work on, that you can build from? That would be my, invest to go slow, a little bit slower to get pace over time and get to that flywheel that Amy mentioned. That's number one. Number two is and I will just do a bit of a plug, very few parts of global enterprises that aren't just tech companies have data like this security organization in your organization does. It has loads of log files, loads of real-time data, loads of structured cases over time. It is a prime target to leverage AI, and to Amy's analogy of a needle and a stack of needles. That's the job every day. And there's a lot of art and science that goes into that, but unlocking that potential of that data source and those teams, we don't actually have a choice at the pace of threats that are coming at us. We don't have a choice, so we have to do it. So I would say start with a foundation and then really encourage and challenge those teams that have unique data, unique skills to really dig in and lead from the front.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe I'll complement it because I think the bit of advice that I have in this moment for us as leaders facing this change is actually to think of yourself as a scaling function for your org rather than them being a scaling function for you. They are going to see all of the data. They're going to have their hands dirty with the tools. They're going to see opportunities in this context that we won't. And so I don't think we're in a leadership moment where we've got all the answers and we know how this is going to go and we can steer the how of our teams. I think this is a moment where we're going to be most successful if we establish the what for our teams and then ask tons of questions. What would have to be true to get Hello World out to production without any human hands on it? What would have to be true for us to be able to, do deep analysis of 100 million transactions a day, or whatever your example is in your environment. Ask your team lots of questions. And then if I can maybe put in another plug for what Sarah mentioned a little earlier, speed's a choice in this moment. Don't give them the time to give you a beautiful report after 2 months where they've identified every possible use case of this and they're giving you a complete analysis. Ask them to go give it a shot and then come back in a week and tell you what they've learned. Yeah. That's going to get your teams much more excited about using this to make their jobs better and what you can deliver to your customers better, which will strengthen your business in the long run. Versus trying to, innovate, but only in the way that I say, which might have been a more successful strategy at other points in the past. I don't know if you've seen that internally.
Yeah, I love that, because the question that I asked my team was, if you had infinite time, where would you focus? Where would you apply that time?
Yeah, I love that.
Because if you think about agents, what could that do to your backlog, to your vulnerabilities, to your logs, to et cetera, et cetera? And I think that unlocks their expertise. And I love that saying, the quickest way to go slow is to centralize everything. So you federate it out, lean on that team within that foundation that you've got, and let them show what they can do.
Agreed.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.